Hello, friends. We only have one more video to go for chapter 30 in your textbook, and then I know that Mr. Spinola is assigning you some material on money, banking, and monetary policy. And after talking with him a little bit about that, we want to try to get that in by by the time the P-test is administered. So it's really important for you to read chapter 31, which is on money, chapter 32, which is on banking, and chapter 33, which is on monetary policy. Now, I'm probably going to skip over money and jump right to banking and monetary policy in our conversations via YouTube. But I'll assume that you read chapter 31 in that discussion, and you'll see how, I'll do that in a moment. But before we get to that, which is going to be future videos, I want to finish up chapter 30 with a conversation about a really controversial and very, very interesting topic that is connected to fiscal policy, and that's the national debt. Here's the thing. Fiscal policy, whether it's discretionary or automatic, can lead to deficits, right? And in a deficit, we discussed this, the federal government is spending more money than it takes in. In order to get that money, it borrows it, right? And the way the government borrows that money to finance a deficit is they issue savings bonds, treasury notes. And these bonds are basically loans. Anyone who buys a bond is basically loaning the government money. So when the United States government can't finance all of its activities through tax revenues, in essence running a deficit, right, it issues bonds. And then people and institutions and governments and come along and buy those bonds, right? And so those deficits, right, that incur generate a debt. All of the savings bonds outstanding, all of the securities that the national government has issued, all of the borrowing that the national government has done from individuals or institutions or whoever, cumulatively is the national debt. And fiscal policy, whether it's automatic or discretionary, tends to lead to deficits which tend to accumulate into a national debt. Now, I asked you the last time that we talked to go on a website called Debt to the Penny. And if you did go on that website, Debt to the Penny, you would have gotten the debt on the day that you went to the website. So I went there today, and today I think is the 8th, and I think the last day that the Debt to the Penny was on, that was on the 7th, and this was the national debt as of May 7, 2020. 25 trillion, 142 billion, 400,455,245.54. Let me say it again. The national debt as of the 7th of May was 25,142,400,455,245.54. Now, that is a staggering number, and here's what it means. There is out there, the United States government has roughly issued $25 trillion worth of security that someone holds. The government is liable to pay all of those securities given the circumstances of how they were issued, right? So that's the national debt. And one of the things that I asked you was, the question that I asked you when I introduced this in the last video is I said, go on Debt to the Penny, look at the debt, and then think to yourself, is that $25 trillion debt a problem? Now you might say, kind of retired, bald instructor. I mean, maybe in your retirement you've lost it a tad, because it's a ridiculous question to ask whether a $25 trillion debt is a problem. However, let me ask you this. Let's say this was true. Let's say into the classroom, which we don't have, because of COVID-19. You're at your home. But let's say we were in the classroom, room 224, right? And in the classroom walked a modestly dressed person, a man of the age of 30. And he had normal casual clothes on. He was of average height and average build, right? There would be nothing about him that was unusual, right? And he walked in, and I said to you, this man is $100,000 in debt. Is that a problem for him? Now, 100,000 is a big number. This is just a guy. Is $100,000 debt a problem for him? But then I went on to say, you can ask me questions about his debt to determine whether that $100,000 debt is a problem for that man. So in this classroom, you'd be thinking, what would be a good question to ask to determine whether that debt was a problem for that man? What would be a good question? So now you're thinking now, and I wish you were thinking, but I know you're not. What you're going to do is just wait for me to tell you, but I'm going to pretend like you're thinking, what would be a good question? What would be a good question? Right? I don't know. Hey, how about this? Who does he owe the money to? I mean, does he owe the money to a bank? Does he owe the money to a loan shark? Right? Who does he owe the money to? That might be a good question, right? What else might be a good question? What did he borrow it for? Did he borrow $100,000 to go to Harvard Medical School? Right? Did he borrow $100,000 on vacations and other things and some kind of failed business or some sort? I mean, what did he borrow the money for? What's the result of the loan? Right? And, another question that we might ask is, what's his income? I mean, how much does he make? Does he make $1 million a year? If so, 100,000 isn't much. Is he unemployed? 100,000 is quite a bit. So I guess my point is, in order to determine whether the debt is a problem, regardless of its size, then we really have to know some things about the nature of that debt. I mean, we might want to know what the interest rate is on that debt. We might want to know that. But I mean, we would certainly want to know who this person owes the debt to. So now let's take that same question and apply that to the national debt. The debt is owed by the United States to someone. Now, if you went on I think it is page 619 in your text. Let's see. Yes, page 619 in your text. If you went to page 619 in your text, there's a pie diagram of 2007. It's fairly out of date, but what it does give you is a breakdown of the kind of categories of who holds the debt. And one thing that's interesting is a significant percentage of the national debt is held by the government itself. They may say, what do you speak of, kind instructor? I mean, what do you mean the government itself holds its own debt? Yes. The government from time to time has surplus funds that they allocate, and then those funds just don't sit there. The government puts those funds into things that make it money, which often is their own debt, which pays the government interest. Right? So the government itself, the national government itself, holds a significant number of the securities that are outstanding. The biggest single holder of the national debt is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve System is the national bank. They're the biggest single holder, and their government too. State and local governments hold the debt, right? And so a significant amount of the debt is held by governments, whether they're local, state, or the national government itself. Another big group that holds the debt are institutions, banks, and mutual funds, and other financial entities. They hold the debt. Now, you might say, well, how about people? Individuals, do they buy savings bonds? Well, yes. I mean, it's not a tremendous fraction of the debt that's held by individuals, you and I, But you could buy a savings bond. People may have gifted you savings bonds, and those savings bonds are part of the national debt. If you have a $50 savings bond, you own the debt, right? If your parents have savings bonds, they own the debt, right? Now you might say, can foreigners buy? Can the Chinese? Well, yeah, they could, and they do. All sorts of foreign countries buy our securities and hold our debt. Now, I should tell you that Americans buy Chinese bonds as well, and institutions buy bonds in other countries as well. So yes, I mean, there is a significant number, a growing amount is held by foreigners. So you could go on Debt to the Penny and see who holds the percentages of the debt as of yesterday, right? I mean, that's certainly true, but it isn't it isn't as problematic as it seems. Like, we owe this debt to. I mean, we owe this debt to lots and lots and lots and lots of entities and individuals and institutions, right? Um, the next question is, what is it gone for? Well, this is kind of tough to illustrate, to discuss without an illustration. But if I had an illustration of the debt, what you would see, yes, hang on, I'll get it. Many apologies. Um, you would see that the majority of the debt it was accumulated during wars, and then the rest of the debt, until just very recently, right? Until just very recently, was accumulated during recessions, which is a function of automatic stabilizers. But there was a change in 1980. When Ronald Reagan was elected to the presidency, he argued that he was going to pay off, he was going to balance the budget, right? Much like when Donald Trump was elected to the presidency, he said he's going to balance the budget. Both of those people, Trump and Reagan, did exactly the same thing. They cut taxes and increased military spending, and only modestly reduced domestic spending, if at all. And so the result was structural deficits in, the Reagan administration and in the Trump administration, frankly. That both of those times, and those were aberrations in typically what's true. Now, obviously, if we accumulate a large debt to fight World War II, then we say, okay, that's understandable, and even to fight recessions. But some of the others are a little bit more questionable. Well, okay. That's the second thing. And the third thing is, what was the debt? Who was the debt to? What was it borrowed for? Who was it owed to? And we talked about what it was borrowed for, who it's owed to. Oh, what's the income of the man? What's the income of the United States? Well, the income of the United States is GDP. And one of the biggest things that we look at is the ratio between debt and GDP. And the ratio between debt and GDP has at times been higher and has at times been lower. I mean, it was, very low in 2000, much lower than it had been, at the end of World War II or other times in American history. Now it's very high. So the ratio of debt to GDP is something that you could see charted on page 620 in your text. But again, that's somewhat dated. But it's suffice to say, right now, we have a pretty significant debt to GDP ratio. A pretty significant debt to GDP ratio with the mammoth stimulus package that was passed with COVID-19. Now, that brings us to this question. You might say, well, okay, kind instructor, that's kind of a slick way of looking at this, with the guy coming in and everything, and you give us a perspective on that. But, buddy, the debt is $25 trillion, and how in the heck are we going to pay it off? Well, that's the biggest misconception about the national debt, and that is that the debt never needs to be paid. You might say, well, wait a minute. Of course it needs to be paid. You owe it, you have to pay it. No, never needs to be paid. And the reason the debt doesn't need to be paid is it is revolving. So I have a savings bond, right? I hold the national debt. It's a $50 bond. I cash it in. the government gives me a $50. What they do is they pay me the interest, but they reissue the bond to somebody else, right? So they just reissue the bond to somebody else. So constantly the national debt is turning over. Some people are paying, right? Some people are being paid for the national debt, and some people are holding it, and then they're cashing it in and they're selling to others, and they're cashing it in, they're selling to others, they're cashing it in and selling to others. You might say, how long can this go on? As long as people are willing to let it. As long as people are willing to hold $25 trillion worth of securities, the national government can hold those securities forever, right? I mean, that's just a fact. There is no day of reckoning. There is no foreclosure. You can go and get your money at any time, and the national government can reissue those bonds as long as somebody's willing to buy them, right? Now, you might say, well, what if no one wants to buy them? Then that tends to drive interest rates up to get people to attract to buy them, and that could be a problem. But right now it's not. So that explanation goes to a second explanation. Does the national debt burden future generations? And the answer is not in a way that you might suspect. You think if the debt never needs to be paid, future generations are not on the hook for it. That's just not true. Look, up until just recently, the biggest accumulation of the debt was during World War II. I'm a child of the generation that fought World War II. They accumulated big debt. I never had to pay. Right? They didn't suddenly come to me and say, hey, Wallace, you owe your section of the national debt. You got to pay. No. I'm the child, and my children are the grandchildren. They never had to pay. Right? So it's not true that future generations are burdened with the actual payment of the debt. But there are ways that the debt does burden society and future generations in two big ways. One is the interest. Now, the interest is relatively low on the national debt, but it's the third highest expenditure in the national budget. So every dollar we pay in interest on the national debt is a dollar that could go for something else, or a dollar that could go back into your pocket, which makes the question of what the debt is going for more viable in terms of evaluating it, right? If you're going to pay interest on this forever and ever and ever, interest on $25 trillion, then that's going to come from tax revenues and other things, okay, right? Now, most of that interest goes back to ourselves, but still it's a burden. And the other burden is crowding out. And we talked about that before. Crowding out is this notion that if the government borrows a dollar, somebody else isn't. So if there's $25 trillion in debt, that means that $25 trillion could have been borrowed by someone else. What would they have done with it? Right? Would they have invented it and invested it in plant and capital? Would the United States be a much more prosperous country if those dollars would have been borrowed by private industry rather than the government? So it gets back to the question of what does the money go for? Crowding out, it's true. A dollar spent by the government is not a dollar. A dollar borrowed by the government and spent by the government is not a dollar borrowed and spent by a business or anyone else. So those are the two big issues associated with the national debt, and that could burden future generations, but it's complicated. Well, I hope this was beneficial. I'm sorry about that interruption in the middle of it, right? I am at my home, and so if you have any questions about this, feel free to reach out to Mr. Spinola or reach out to me. All right, monetary policy next.